Good evening. Welcome to Reading Grounds. Tonight it is May 12th, 2019. Thank you for joining us if you are listening. If you are listening live, please feel free to say hello in the chat. And if you are listening after the fact, feel free to pop in the comments. Last time we talked about Cinco de Mayo, since it was May 5th. Talked about the history of it, went over it a little bit. Not in particular depth, but I did read a little bit about it and talk about how it's actually a bigger holiday in the United States than it is in Mexico. Thank you for joining us tonight, Kagan. Always nice to have you on the stream. Let's take a look at the Wikipedia front page for tonight. Today's featured article is Interstate 94 in Michigan. It is part of the United States Interstate Highway Program system that runs east from the Indiana state line near Lake Michigan through the southern Lower Peninsula to Detroit, then northeast to Port Huron. In the news recently, Judd Trump, I don't know if there's any relation, probably not, wins the World Snooker Championship, defeating John Higgins in the final. The United Nations reports that due to human activity, the Earth's biodiversity has suffered a catastrophic decline unprecedented in human history. Aeroflot Flight 1492 crash landed and burst into flames at Sheremetyevo International Airport, Moscow, killing 41 of the 78 people on board. Wow. On this day in history, which is May 13th, according to Wikipedia, in 1779, Russian and French mediators negotiated the Treaty of Teschen to end the War of the Bavarian Succession. In 1861, the Australian astronomer John Tebbutt discovered the Great Comet of 1861, through the tail of which the Earth passed later that year. So the Earth passed through the tail of it. Very interesting. And there's a picture on Wikipedia of a painting that's kind of interesting. If you want to go take a look, that's the Great Comet of 1861. On this day, May 13th, 1940, 3 days after becoming the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Winston Churchill gave his blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech to the House of Commons. In 1995, Alison Hargreaves became the first woman to reach the summit of Mount Everest without the aid of Sherpas or bottled oxygen. In 2014, the worst mining disaster in Turkish history took place when an explosion caused an underground mine fire at a coal mine in Soma Manisa, leaving 301 people dead. Let's see if there's any interesting trivia. That is Papua, Papu. I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, to be honest. Traditionally, the Maybrat language of that particular country uses a base 5 counting system. The early study of geology of China led to the idea of a changeable climate and that drinking dissolved fossils was good for your health. Yeah, because there's nothing quite like a tall glass of crude oil for breakfast. Wolfgang Meyer, who recorded Mozart's clarinet concerto on a historical Bassett clarinet, played his last concert with jazz saxophonist Peter Lell. I'm not sure what to do with that information, but that is interesting. Well, as for tonight, I do have a little bit of an agenda. Tonight, I think we will take a quick look at the American writer Philip K. Dick. There's no laughing on that name because that's really his name. Hopefully, a little later tonight, we will read a little more of And Then There Were None. But anyways, Philip K. Dick, his middle name was Kindred, interestingly, was born December 16th, 1928, and he died in March 2nd, 1982, at the age of 53. He was an American writer known for his work as science fiction. He explored philosophical, social, and political themes, with stories dominated by monopolistic corporations, alternate universes, authoritarian governments, and altered states of consciousness. His writing also reflected his interest in metaphysics and theology, and often drew upon his life experiences, addressing the nature of reality, identity, drug abuse, schizophrenia, and transcendental experiences. Dick published 44 novels and approximately 121 short stories, most of which appeared in science fiction magazines during his lifetime. Coincidentally, his high school graduation class included the fantasy author Ursula K. Le Guin, although they didn't know each other until long after this. Um, she is the author who wrote the Earthsea series, which I've heard is incredible. I've heard nothing but good things. I have not had a chance to read it myself, unfortunately. Maybe someday I'll get that. I'll get around to that. I sure hope so. But for now, I'll just have to take people's word for it. Philip K. Dick was the author of a book called The Man in High Castle, which was an alternate history novel, and the only time he won a Hugo Award for one of his books. It has since been adapted into a Amazon Prime TV series with the same name about an alternate history where the Third Reich wins World War II and takes over the United States. Um, he also had other science fiction novels such as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the inspiration for Blade Runner. He wrote a novel called Flow My Tears, the policeman said, which won him the John W. Campbell Memorial Award for Best Science Fiction Novel. Following a series of religious experiences in February 1974, Dick's work engaged more explicitly with issues of theology, philosophy, and the nature of reality, such as in novels such as A Scanner Darkly, which has been adapted into a movie by Richard Linklater. Some of his works, as I've mentioned, have been adapted into movies or TV shows. Blade Runner, of course, was one, adapted from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Total Recall was also adapted from one of his stories, as was Minority Report, which is adapted from a short story of his. The Scanner Darkly, of course, and The Adjustment Bureau as well. In 2005, Time magazine named his novel Ubik, U-B-I-K, published in 1969, one of the 100 greatest English language novels published since 1923. In 2007, Dick became the first science fiction writer ever to be included in the Library of America series. I've read a little bit of Philip K. Dick on my own. Mostly, however, that was actually it's very little. I read his short story Minority Report. I did not finish it, as short as it was. Not that it was particularly bad. I think I just got distracted. I may have been reading it while on the job, which I shouldn't have been doing, but I was bored. But the real reason I wanted to take a look at Philip K. Dick, less than his stories and more for his personalities, I'm going to try and read some of his short stories if I can. But more than that, I want to read a little bit about his life, more than I already have. Hello, Tyler. Thank you for coming on the stream. Always nice to have you. Now, Philip K. Dick had a twin sister, actually, named Jane Charlotte. They were both born 6 weeks prematurely. but his twin sister died 6 weeks after their birth, and this profoundly affected his life, leading to the recurrent motif of the phantom twin in his books. Interestingly enough, Philip K. Dick was enrolled at John Eaton Elementary School, completing the second through fourth grades. His lowest grade was a C in written composition, although a teacher remarked that he showed interest and ability in storytelling. And it wasn't until after he left the school that he became interested in science fiction. In 1963, when Dick won the Hugo Award for The Man in High Castle, although he was hailed as a genius in the science fiction world, the mainstream literary world was unappreciative, and he could only publish books through low paying science fiction publishers such as Ace. Even in his later years, he continued to have financial troubles. In 1971, his marriage to Nancy Hackett broke down. She moved out of their house in California. Having struggled with amphetamine abuse for much of the past decade, which stemmed in part from his need to maintain a prolific writing regimen due to the financial exigencies of the science fiction field, he allowed other drug users to move into the house. Following the release of 21 novels between 1960 and 1970, which is kind of insane, these developments were exacerbated by unprecedented periods of writer's block, with Dick ultimately failing to publish new fiction until 1974. So he went 4 years after that without publishing anything. And of course, a 10-year period where he published 21 novels. That's a little more than that's that's more than two novels a year, which is kind of insane. But that's what it took, I suppose, to be able to make it all work, to be able to make a living. One day in November, Philip K. Dick returned to his home to discover that it had been burglarized, with his safe blown open and personal papers missing. Police were unable to determine the culprit and even suspected him of having done it himself. Shortly thereafterwards, he was invited to be a guest of honor at the Vancouver Science Fiction Convention in February 1972. Within a day of arriving at the conference and giving his speech, The Android and the Human, he informed people that he had fallen in love with a woman named Janice, whom he had met there, and announced he would be remaining in Vancouver. An attendee of the conference, Michael Walsh, movie critic for a local newspaper, invited Dick to stay in his home, but asked him to leave after 2 weeks due to his erratic behavior. This was followed by Janice ending her and Dick's relationship and moving away. On March 23rd, 1972, Dick attempted suicide by taking an overdose of the sedative potassium bromide. Subsequently, after deciding to seek help, Dick became a participant in Ex-Calais, a Canadian Synanon type recovery program, and was well enough by April to return to California. Upon returning to Orange County at the behest of California State University, Fullerton professor Willis McNelly, who initiated a correspondence with Dick during his Ex-Calais stint, donated manuscripts, papers, and other materials to the University Special Collections Library, where they are archived in Philip K. Dick Science Fiction Collection in the Pollack Library. Dick returned to the events of these months while writing his 1977 novel Scanner Darkly, which contains fictionalized depictions of the burglary of his home, his time using amphetamines and living with addicts, and his experiences of Ex-Calais, portrayed in the novel as New Path. A factual account of Dick's recovery program participation was portrayed in his posthumously released book, The Dark-Haired Girl, a collection of letters and journals from the period. On February 20th, 1974, while recovering from the effects of sodium pentothal administered for the extraction of an impacted wisdom tooth, Dick received a home delivery of Darwin from a young woman. When he opened the door, he was struck by the beauty of the dark-haired girl and was especially drawn to her golden necklace. He asked her about its curious fish-shaped design. She said it was a sign used by early Christians, and then left. Dick called the symbol the vesicle Pisces. The name seems to have been based on his conflation of two related symbols: the Christian ichthys symbol, which is the Jesus fish you see on people's bumper stickers at times, which the woman was wearing, and the Vesica piscis, I suppose that would be, which is basically the middle part of a Venn diagram, that oval shape. Dick recounted that as the sun glinted off the golden pendant, the reflection caused the generation of a pink beam of light that mesmerized him. He came to believe that that beam imparted wisdom and clairvoyance, and also believed it to be intelligent. On one occasion, Dick was startled by a separate recurrence of the pink beam. It imparted the information to him that his infant son was ill. Dix rushed the child to the hospital, where his suspicion was confirmed by professional diagnosis. After the woman's departure, Dick began to experience strange hallucinations. Although initially attributing them to side effects from medication, he considered this explanation implausible after weeks of continued hallucinations. Quote, I experienced an invasion of my mind by a transcendentally rational mind, as if I had been insane all my life and suddenly had become sane, unquote. That was Philip K. Dick himself, as he told Charles Platt. Throughout February and March 1974, Dick experienced a series of hallucinations, which he referred to as 2374, shorthand for February through March 1974. Aside from the pink beam, Dick described the initial hallucinations as geometric patterns and occasionally brief pictures of Jesus in ancient Rome. As the hallucinations increased in length and frequency, Dick claimed he began to live two parallel lives, one as himself, Philip K. Dick, and one as Thomas, a Christian persecuted by Romans in the 1st century AD. He referred to the transcendentally rational mind as zebra, God, and Valis, Valis, which I suppose is an acronym? Is that the phrase? Dick wrote about the experiences first in the semi-autobiographical novel Radio Free Abelmuth, and then in Valis, Valis, The Divine Invasion and the Unfinished Owl in Daylight, part of the Valis trilogy. In 1974, Dick wrote a letter to the FBI accusing various people, including University of California San Diego professor Frederick Jameson, of being foreign agents of Warsaw Pact powers. He also wrote that Stanislaw Lem was probably a false name used by a composite committee operating on orders of the Communist Party to gain control over public opinion. At one point, Dick felt he had been taken over by the spirit of the prophet Elijah. He believed that an episode in his novel Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, was a detailed retelling of a biblical story from the book of Acts, which he had never read. Dick documented and discussed his experiences and faith in a private journal he called his Exegesis, portions of which were later published as the Exegesis of Philip K. Dick. The last novel Dick wrote was The Transmigration of Timothy Archer. It was published shortly after his death in 1982. Now, let me think here. I believe that that book, the Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, was originally how I discovered this page. Yes, okay. So there's an episode of The Twilight Zone, the original Twilight Zone, that has a very similar plot to this. The plot of the Twilight Zone episode is that this guy wakes up after a night of drinking. He wakes up in his bed with his wife next to him, and he has to go to work. The problem is his wife doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's a home intruder. So he leaves, he goes to work. Nobody there recognizes him, and somebody else has taken his spot at his desk. Nobody knows who he is. Nobody has any memory of him. They think he just created this memory. Or that he's a crazy person. So he gets institutionalized and he tries to prove it. And just as he's about to give up hope, he wakes up in his bed again. And of course, things are normal. His wife wakes up and she, knows who he is. It's not a problem. But then when she comes back from the bathroom, he realizes that she's a different woman. Like, even though she knows who he is, she does not look at all like she did. She's a completely different person. And so that's how the episode ends, is that, uh, with a little bit of uncertainty and about reality. And Flow My Tears, the policeman said, is a very similar story, but it has to do less with an unexplained phenomenon like the Twilight Zone tends to do, and more with a drug hallucination that gets explained at the end of the novel. But as I was looking up the Wikipedia page for the Twilight Zone episode, I happened upon it. It mentions, I believe, at the end of the article, "Flow My Tears," the policeman said, the Philip K. Dick novel, which actually came out more than a decade after the Twilight Zone episode. I don't know if it was deliberate. I don't think it was. It doesn't strike me as something Philip K. Dick would do to base a book on a Twilight Zone episode, especially because there's no direct mention of that on the article about the book. Um, Maybe it was an unintentional thing, but it didn't seem to bother anyone. It was nominated for a Nebula Award, a Hugo Award, and was awarded the John W. Campbell Memorial Award for Best Science Fiction Novel, which I had mentioned earlier. But there's a little bit of there's a little bit more that's interesting about that book on the Wikipedia page. The article is the sub-article, I suppose it would be, is author's interpretation. It says, in his undelivered speech, How to Build a Universe That Doesn't Fall Apart 2 days later, Dick recounts how, in describing an incident at the end of the book to an Episcopalian priest, the priest noted its striking similarity to a scene in the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible. In Dick's book, the police chief meets a black stranger at an all-night gas station and uncharacteristically makes an emotional connection with him. After handing the stranger a drawing of a heart pieced by an arrow, the police chief flies away, but he quickly returns and hugs the stranger, and they strike up a friendly conversation. In the Acts of the Apostles, the disciple Philip meets an Ethiopian eunuch, a black man, sitting in a chariot, to whom he explains a passage from the book of Isaiah and then converts him to Christianity. Dick further notes that 8 years after writing the book, he himself uncharacteristically came to the aid of a black stranger who had run out of gas. After giving the man some money and then driving away, he returned to help the man reach a gas station. Dick was then struck by the similarity between the incident and that described in his book. Dick also recounts an unusual dream he had when writing the book and how he felt compelled to get it into the text of the novel. Years later, he came to interpret the dream as the key to understanding the real meaning of the story, stating, quote, "Deciphered, my novel tells a quite different story from the surface story. The real story is simply this: the return of Christ, now king rather than servant, judge rather than victim of unfair judgment. Everything is reversed. The core message of my novel, without knowing it, was a warning to the powerful. You will shortly be judged and condemned," unquote. Now, the interesting thing, more than all that, hello, Shelby, thanks for coming on, even if it is only for a minute, is that Philip K. Dick, as far as I can tell, was never Christian. And if he wasn't particularly serious about it, as far as I can tell. The only mention of his religious beliefs is more of a general philosophy. It says he described himself as an acosmic panentheist, uh, believing that the universe only as an extension of God. That's a lot of big words, and I don't know what most of them mean. Apparently, panentheism is the belief that the divine pervades and interpenetrates every part of the universe and also extends beyond space and time. Which is certainly an interesting idea. But as far as actual Christianity, it doesn't mention it. It does mention that he, ran the book by a priest, an Episcopalian. For some reason, I always have a hard time pronouncing that. I don't know if that's because he cared for his religious input or if there was some other factor to it. Certainly an interesting individual, being addicted to amphetamines and writing a story which reoccurred, or rather, bear a similarity to something in the Bible without realizing it, um, and then also repeating itself years later in his life. I don't know if that means anything, but it certainly is interesting. Anyways, talking a little bit more about Philip K. Dick. He was married 5 times. One to Jeanette Martin from May to November in 1948. He was married a few other times. His second wife, he was married about 9 years. Third wife, he was married about six. Fourth wife, he was married 6 years. And then his fifth and final wife, he was married for 5 years. Oh, excuse me, for 4 years. Um, his last divorce was in 1977. He ended up passing away in 1982 after completing an interview. Philip K. Dick contacted his therapist complaining of failing eyesight and was advised to go to a hospital immediately, but did not do it. The following day, he was found unconscious on the floor of his Santa Ana home, having suffered a stroke. In the hospital, he suffered another stroke, which led to brain death. 5 days later, he was disconnected from life support and died. After his death, his father took his son's ashes to Riverside Cemetery in Fort Morgan, Colorado, where they were buried next to his twin sister, Jane, who died in infancy. Her tombstone has been inscribed with both of their names at the time of her death, 53 years later. He died months before the release of the first Blade Runner film, which of course was based on his work. So, kind of a strange and interesting person to have such quite a lot going on. Um, Sad that well, it was a sad life, of course, but what can you do, really? But he's had a lot of influence. According to Wikipedia page, he's been credited as an influence for movies like The Matrix, Being John Malkovich, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, The Truman Show, Gattaca, 12 Monkeys, Fight Club, Vanilla Sky, Donnie Darko, Looper, Memento, Inception. I believe there's an award named after him as well, although I can't seem to, at least glancing, I don't see any mention of it on the page. Maybe I'm wrong. Oh, yes. Okay. The Philip K. Dick Award, a science fiction award that annually recognizes a science fiction paperback original published in the U.S. So there are a number of short stories written by him. I would like to take a look at least one of them, hopefully. I have three separate ones. Uh, Three separate ones that I'm kind of toying between the idea. Um, this one I don't know. This short story in particular, I don't know if I really want to go on with it. But I'm going to throw it out as an option. It's called Orpheus with Clay Feet. Um, it's about a bored man living in the future who time travels for a vacation. Um, he ends up going back in time to meet his favorite science fiction author, who is Jack Dowland. There's another one which is called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which is the story that Total Recall was based off of. Total Recall, of course, being one of the better science fiction action movies, uh, directed by the legendary Paul Verhoeven. That one is probably the one I'm going to end up reading. But despite being known for science fiction, there is a short story by Philip K. Dick which is considered fantasy. It's a short story called The King of the Elves, and I don't know anything about it. But apparently, In 2008, Walt Disney Animation Studios produced a 3D animated feature film titled The King of the Elves. I don't know if it's a loyal adaptation, but certainly is interesting. I'm going to look up these stories real quick. So we'll just say that it's a tie between The King of the Elves and Total Recall, because I don't want to do Orpheus with clay feet, actually. Not that it seems like a bad story, but it seems like it's not the sort of story you would want to read aloud, just because it's apparently pretty meta and about, the writer rather than some weirdo on YouTube reading it half a century later. But if you have an input and you're currently watching live, feel free to vote. We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, which is the Total Recall story. That is about 19 pages, based on what I found. Let's see how long King of the Elves is. King of the Elves might not actually be available. That might be copyrighted. Because sometimes when you look up a short story, the first result or two will be it will be an upload of the short story, so you can just read it. Not with King of the Elves though. One of the first links, it seems, is um, the Amazon link, which is usually a sign that you have to pay for it. Tyler, who's probably the only one listening, Tyler has voted for Total Recall. I think I agree. I think that's basically our only choice anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So this is We Can Remember It For You Wholesale by Philip K. Dick. Actually, you know what? Real quick, I think I'm going to mark that on the stream. Such a pain, but what else can you do? Remember it for you. It's funny how certain words in English get capitalized for titles and then others don't. Like it is capitalized but not for. Oh well, what can you do? Okay, now we're going to read it. We Can Remember It For You Wholesale by Philip K. Dick. He awoke and wanted Mars. The valleys, he thought. What would it be like to trudge along among them? Great and greater yet, the dream grew as he became fully conscious. The dream and the yearning. He could almost feel the enveloping presence of the other world, which only government agents and high officials had seen. A clerk like himself? Not likely. Are you getting up or not? His wife Kirsten said drowsily, with her usual hint of fierce crossness. If you are, push the hot coffee button on the darn stove. Okay, Douglas Quayle said, and made his way barefoot from the bedroom of their canapt? Is that a word? Of their canap to the kitchen. There, having dutifully pressed the hot coffee button, he seated himself at the kitchen table, brought out a yellow small tin of fine Dean Swift snuff. He inhaled briskly, and the Beau Nash mixture stung his nose, burned the roof of his mouth. But still he inhaled, and it woke him up and allowed his dreams, his nocturnal desires and random wishes, to condense into a semblance of rationality. I will go, he said to himself. Before I die, I'll see Mars. It was, of course, impossible, and he knew this even as he dreamed. But the daylight, the mundane noise of his wife now brushing her hair before the bedroom mirror, everything conspired to remind him of what he was. A miserable little salaried employee, he said to himself with bitterness. Kirsten reminded him of this at least once a day, and he did not blame her. It was a wife's job to bring her husband down to earth. Down to earth, he thought, and laughed. The figure of speech in this was literally apt. "What are you sniggering about?" his wife asked as she swept into the kitchen, her long, busy pink robe wagging about her. "A dream, I bet. You're always full of them." "Yes," he said, and gazed out into the gazed out the kitchen window at the hover cars and traffic runnels, and all the little energetic people hurrying to work. In a while he would be among them, as always. "I'll bet you had to. I'll bet it had to do with some woman," Kirsten said witheringly. "No," he said, "a god. The god of war. He has wonderful craters with every kind of plant life growing deep down in them." "Listen," Kirsten said. Kirsten said, crouched down beside him and spoke earnestly, the harsh quality momentarily gone from her voice. "The bottom of the ocean, our ocean, is much more, an infinity of times more beautiful. You know that. Everyone knows that. Rent an artificial gill outfit for both of us. Take a week off from work, and we can descend and live down there at one of those year-round aquatic resorts. And in addition," she broke off, "you're not listening. You should be. Here's something a lot better than that compulsion, that obsession you have about Mars, and you don't even listen. God in heaven, you're doomed, Doug. What's going to become of you?" "I'm going to work," he said, rising to his feet, his breakfast forgotten. "That's what's going to become of me." She eyed him. "You're getting worse, more fanatical every day. Where's it going to lead?" "To Mars," he said, and opened the door to the closet to get down a fresh shirt to wear to work. Having descended from the taxi, Douglas Quayle slowly walked across 3 densely populated foot runnels into the modern, attractively inviting doorway. There he halted, impeding mid-morning traffic, and with caution read the shifting color neon sign. He had, in the past, scrutinized this sign before, but never had he come so close. This was very different. What he did now was something else, something which sooner or later had to happen. Recall Incorporated. Was this the answer? After all, an illusion, no matter how convincing, remained nothing more than an illusion, at least objectively, but subjectively, quite the opposite entirely. And anyhow, he had made an appointment within the next 5 minutes. Taking a deep breath of mildly smog-infested Chicago air, he walked through the dazzling polychromatic shimmer of the doorway and up to the receptionist's counter. The nicely articulated blonde at the counter, bare-bosomed and tidy, said pleasantly, "Good morning, Mr. Quayle." "Yes," he said, "I'm here to see about a recall course, as I guess you know." "Not recall, whatever. Recall," the receptionist corrected him. "I should state, it's spelled Rekal, and I guess I was supposed to pronounce that differently, even though I had it right and Douglas Quayle had it wrong. The moron. Whatever." She picked up the receiver of the vidphone by her smooth elbow and said into it, "Mr. Douglas Quayle is here, Mr. McLean. May he come inside now, or is it too soon?" "Gets wetter wom wom wom," the phone mumbled. "Yes, Mr. Quayle," she said. "You may go in. Mr. McLean is expecting you." As he started off uncertainly, she called after him, "Room D, Mr. Quayle, to your right." After a frustrating but brief moment of being lost, he found the proper room. The door hung open, and inside, at a big genuine walnut desk, sat a genial-looking man, middle-aged, wearing the latest Martian frog pelt gray suit. His attire alone would have told Quayle that he had come to the right person. "Sit down, Douglas," Mr. McLean said, waving his plump hand towards the chair which faced the desk. "So you want to have gone to Mars. Very good." Quayle seated himself, feeling tense. "I'm not so sure this is worth the fee," he said. "It costs a lot, and as far as I can see, I really get nothing. Costs almost as much as going," he thought. "You get tangible proof of your trip?" Mr. McLean disagreed emphatically. "All the proof you'll ever need. Here, I'll show you." He dug within a drawer of his impressive desk. "Ticket stub." Reaching into a manila folder, he produced a small square of embossed cardboard. It proves you went and returned." "Postcards?" He laid out 4 frank pictures, 3D full-color postcards, in a neatly arranged row on the desk for Quayle to see. "Film. Shots you took of local sites on Mars with a rented moving camera." To Quayle he displayed those too, plus the names of people you met, 200 postcreds worth of souvenirs, which will arrive from Mars within the following month, and passport certificates listing the shots you received, and more. He glanced up keenly at Quayle. "You'll know you went there all right. You won't remember us, won't remember me, or ever having been here. It'll be a real trip in your mind, we'll guarantee that. A full 2 weeks of recall. Every last piddling detail. Remember this. If at any time you doubt that you really took an extensive trip to Mars, you can return here and get a full refund. You see? But I didn't go, Quayle said. I wouldn't have gone, no matter what proofs you provided me with. He took a deep, unsteady breath. And I never was a secret agent with Interplan. It seemed impossible to him that recall incorporated its extra-factual memory implant would do its job, despite what he had heard people say. Mr. Quayle, McLean said patiently, as you explained in your letter to us, you have no chance, no possibility the slightest, of ever getting to Mars. You can't afford it. And what is much more important, you can never qualify as an undercover agent for Interplan or anybody else. This is the only way you can achieve your lifelong dream. Am I not correct, sir? You can't be this. You can't actually do this. But you can have been and have done. We see to that, and our fee is reasonable. No hidden charges. He smiled encouragingly. Is an extra factual memory that convincing? More than the real thing, sir. Had you really gone to Mars as an Interplan agent, you would by now have forgotten a great deal. Our analysis of true mem systems, authentic recollections of major events in a person's life, shows that a variety of details are very quickly lost to the person, forever. Part of the package we offer you is such a deep implantation of recall that nothing is forgotten. The packet which is fed to you while you're comatose is the creation of trained experts, men who have spent years on Mars. In every case, we verify details down to the last iota. And you've picked a rather easy extra-factual system. Had you picked Pluto or wanted to be the emperor of the Interplanet Alliance, we'd have much more difficulty, and the charges would be considerably greater. Reaching into his coat for his wallet, Quayle said, "Okay, it's been my lifelong ambition, and so I see I'll never really do it. So I guess I'll have to settle for this. Don't think of it that way. You're not accepting second best. The actual memory, with all of its vagueness, omissions, and ellipses, not to say distortions, that's second best." He accepted the money and pressed a button on his desk. "All right, Mr. Quayle," he said as the door of his office opened and two burly men swiftly entered. "You're on your way to Mars as a secret agent." He rose, came over to shake Quayle's nervous, moist hand. "Or rather, you have been on your way. This afternoon at 4:30 you will arrive back here on Terra. A cab will leave you off of your Connaught, and as I say, you will never remember seeing me or coming here. You won't, in fact, even remember having heard of our existence." His mouth dry with nervousness, Quayle followed the two technicians from the office. What happened next depended on them. "Well, I actually believe I've been on Mars," he wondered. "That I managed to fulfill my lifetime ambition?" He had a strange, lingering intuition that something would go wrong. But just what? He did not know. He would have to wait to find out. The intercom on McLean's desk, which connected him with the work area of the firm, buzzed and a voice said, "Mr. Klein is under sedation now, sir. Do you want to supervise this one, or shall we go ahead?" "It's routine," McLean observed. "You may go ahead, Lowe. I don't think you'll run into any trouble." Programming an artificial memory of a trip to another planet, with or without the Philip, Fillip, I've never heard that word, of being a secret agent, showed up on the firm's work schedule with monotonous regularity. "In 1 month," he calculated wryly, "we must do 20 of these. Earthstat's interplanetary travel has become our bread and butter." "Whatever you say, Mr. McLean," Lowe's voice came, and thereupon the intercom shut off. Going to the vault section in the chamber behind his office, McLean searched about for a 3-packet trip to Mars and a 62-packet secret Interplan spy. Finding these 2 packets, he returned with them to his desk, seated himself comfortably, and poured out the contents, merchandise which would be planted in Quill's Connaught while the lab technicians busied themselves installing false memories. A 1-portioned Sneaky Pete sidearm, McLean reflected. That's the largest item, set us back financially the most. Then a pellet-sized transmitter, which could be swallowed if the agent were caught. Codebook that astonishingly resembled the real thing. The firm's models were highly accurate, based, whenever possible, on actual U.S. military issue. Odd bits which made no intrinsic sense, but which would be woven into the warp and woof of Quayle's imaginary trip, would coincide with his memory. Half an ancient silver 50-cent piece, several quotations from John Donne's sermons written incorrectly, each on a separate piece of transparent tissue-thin paper, several match folders from bars on Mars, a stainless steel spoon engraved "Property of Dome Mars national kibbuzim, a wire tapping coil which the intercom buzzed. Mr. McLean, I'm sorry to bother you, but something rather ominous has come up. Maybe it would be better if you were in here after all. Quayle is already under sedation. He reacted well to the narcodrine. He's completely unconscious and receptive, but I'll be in, sensing trouble. McLean left his office. A moment later, he emerged in the work area. On a hygienic bed lay Douglas Quayle, breathing slowly and regularly, his eyes virtually shut. He seemed dimly, but only dimly, aware of the two technicians, and now McLean himself. There's no space to insert false memory patterns? McLean felt irritation. Merely dropped 2 work weeks. He's employed as a clerk at the West Coast Immigration Bureau, which is a government agency, so he undoubtedly has or had 2 weeks vacation within the last year. That ought to do it. Petty details annoyed him, and always would. Our problem, Lowe said sharply, is something quite different. He bent over the bed, said to Quayle, Tell Mr. McLean what you told us. To Mr. McLean he said, Listen closely. The gray-green eyes of the man laying supine in the bed focused on McLean's face. The eyes, he observed uneasily, had become hard. They had a polished, inorganic quality, like semi-precious tumbled stones. He was not sure that he liked what he saw. The brilliance was too cold. What do you want now? Quayle said harshly. You've broken my cover. Get out of here before I take you all apart. He studied McLean. Especially you, he continued. You're in charge of this counter-operation. Lowe said, How long were you on Mars? 1 month, Quayle said gratingly. And your purpose there? The meager lips twisted. Quayle eyed him and did not speak. At last, drawing the words out so they dripped with hostility, he said, Agent for Interplan, as I've told you already. Don't you record everything that's said? Play your vid-odd tape back for your boss and leave me alone. He shut his eyes then. The hard brilliance ceased. Mr. McLean felt instantly a rushing splurge of relief. Lowe said quietly, This is a tough man, Mr. McLean. He won't be, McLean said, after we arrange him to lose his memory chain again. He'll be as meek as before. To Quayle, he said, So this is why you wanted to go to Mars so terribly bad. Without opening his eyes, Quayle said, I never wanted to go to Mars. I was assigned it. They handed it to me, and there I was stuck. Oh, yeah, I admit I was curious about it. Who wouldn't be? Then he opened his eyes and surveyed the 3 of them, McLean in particular. Quite a truth drug you've got here. It brought up things I had absolutely no memory of. He pondered. I wonder about Kirsten, he said half to himself. Could she be in on it? An interplay contact keeping an eye on me? To be certain I don't regain my memory? No wonder she's been so derisive about my wanting to go there. Faintly, he smiled. The smile, one of understanding, disappeared almost at once. McLean said, Please believe me, Mr. Quayle. We stumbled onto this entirely by accident. In the work we do, I believe you, Quayle said. He seemed tired now. The drug was pulling him under, deeper and deeper. Where did I say I had been? He murmured. Mars? Hard to remember. I know I'd like to see it. So would everybody else. But me? His voice trailed off. Just a clerk. A nothing clerk. Straightening up, Lowe said to his superior, He wants a false memory implanted that corresponds to a trip he actually took, and a false reason which is the real reason. He's telling the truth. He's a long way down in the narcodrine. The trip is very vivid in his mind, at least under sedation, but apparently he doesn't recall it otherwise. Someone, probably a government military sciences lab, erased his conscious memories. All he knew was that going to Mars meant something special to him, and so did becoming a secret agent. They couldn't erase it. That's not a memory but a desire, undoubtedly the same one that motivated him to volunteer for the assignment in the first place. The other technician, Keeler, said to McLean, What do we do? Graft a false memory pattern over the real memory? There's no telling what the results would be. He might remember some of the genuine trip, and the confusion might bring on psychotic interlude. He'd have to hold 2 opposite premises in his mind simultaneously, that he went to Mars and that he didn't. That's a genuine agent for Interplan. That he's a genuine agent for Interplan, and he's not. That it's spurious. Spurious? I think we ought to revive him without any false memory implantation and send him out of here. This is hot. Agreed, McLean said. A thought came to him. Can you predict what he'll remember when he comes out of sedation? Impossible to tell, Lowe said. He'll probably have some dim, diffused memory of his actual trip now. And he'd probably be in grave doubt as to its validity. He'd probably decide our programming slipped a gear tooth. And he'd remember coming here. That wouldn't be erased, unless you wanted erased. "The less we mess with this man," McLean said, "the better I like it. There's nothing for us to fool around with. We've been foolish enough to, or unlucky enough to, uncover a genuine interplan spy who has a cover so perfect that up to now he didn't even know he was, or rather is. The sooner they wash their hands of the man calling himself Douglas Quayle, the better." "Are you going to plant packets 3 and 62 in his Connaught?" Lowe said. "No," McLean said, "and we're going to return half his fee." "Half? Why half?" McLean said lamely. "Seems like a good compromise." As the cab carried him back to his Connaught at the residential end of Chicago, Douglas Quaid said to himself, "It's sure good to be back on Terra." Already the month-long period on Mars had begun to waver in his memory. He had only an image of profound gaping craters, an ever-present ancient erosion of hills, of vitality, of motion itself, a world of dust where little happened, where a good part of the day was spent checking and rechecking one's portable oxygen source, and then the life forms, the unassuming and modest gray-brown cacti and maw-worms. As a matter of fact, he had brought back several moribund examples of Martian fauna. He had smuggled them through customs. After all, they posed no menace. They couldn't survive in Earth's heavy atmosphere. Reaching into his coat pocket, he rummaged for the container of Martian maw-worms and found an envelope instead. Lifting it out, he discovered, to his perplexity, that it contained 570 postcreds, in cred bills a low denomination. "Where'd I get this?" he asked himself. "Didn't I spend every cred I had on my trip?" With the money came a slip of paper marked, "1 half feed returned by Mr. McLean." Then the date, today's date. "Recall," he said aloud. "Recall what, sir or madam?" the robot driver of the cab inquired respectfully. "Do you have a phone book?" Quayle demanded. "Certainly, sir or madam." A slot opened, and from it slid a microtape phone book for Cook County. "It's spelled oddly," Quayle said as he leafed through the pages of the yellow section. He felt fear then, a biting fear. "Here it is," he said. "Take me there, to Recall Incorporated. I changed my mind. I don't want to go home." "Yes, sir or madam, as the case may be," the driver said. A moment later, the cab was zipping back in the opposite direction. "May I use your phone?" he asked. "Be my guest," the robot driver said, and presented a shiny new Emperor 3D color phone to him. He dialed his own Connaught. After a pause, found himself confronted by a miniature but chillingly realistic image of Kirsten on the small screen. "I've been to Mars," he told her. "You're drunk," her lips writhed scornfully. "Or worse." "It's God's truth." "What? When?" she demanded. "I don't know." He felt confused. "A simulated trip, I think. By means of one of those artificial or extra-factual whatever it is memory places. It didn't take." Kirsten said witheringly, "You are drunk," and broke the connection at her end. He hung up, then, feeling his face flush. "Always the same tone," he said hotly to himself. "Always the retort, as if she knows everything and I know nothing. What a marriage." Kirist, he thought dismally. A moment later, the cab stopped at the curb before a modern, very attractive little pink building, over which a shifting polychromatic neon sign read "Recall Incorporated." The receptionist, chic and bare from the waist up, started in surprise, then gained masterful control of herself. "Oh, hello, Mr. Quayle," she said nervously. "How are you? Did you forget something?" "The rest of my fee back," he said. More composed now, the receptionist said, "Fee? I think you are mistaken, Mr. Quayle. You were here discussing the feasibility of extra-factual trip for you, but—" She shrugged her smooth, pale shoulders. "As I understand it, no trip was taken." Quayle said, "I remember everything, miss. My letter to Recall Incorporated, which started this whole business off. I remember my arrival here, my visit with Mr. McLean, then the 2 lab technicians taking me in tow and administering a drug to put me out." No wonder the firm had returned half his fee. The false memory of his trip to Mars hadn't taken, at least not entirely, not as not as he had been assured. "Mr. Quayle," the girl said, "although you are a minor clerk, you are a good-looking man, and it spoils your features to become angry. If it would make you feel any better, I might, let you take me out." He felt furious then. "I remember you," he said savagely. "For instance, the fact that your breasts are sprayed blue. That stuck in my mind. And I remember Mr. McLean's promise that if I remembered my visit to Recall Incorporated, I'd receive my money back in full. Where is Mr. McLean?" After a delay, possibly as long as they could manage, he found himself once more seated facing the imposing walnut desk, exactly as he had been an hour or so earlier in the day. "Some technique you had," Quayle said sardonically. His disappointment and resentment was enormous by now. My so-called memory of a trip to Mars as an undercover agent for Interplan is hazy and vague and shot full of contradictions, and I clearly remember my dealings here with you people. I ought to take this to the Better Business Bureau. Okay, that's still a thing. Okay. He was burning angry at this point. His sense of being cheated had overwhelmed him, had destroyed his customary aversion to participating in a public squabble. Looking morose as well as cautious, McLean said, "We capitulate, Quayle. We'll refund the balance of your fee. I fully concede the fact that that we did absolutely nothing for you." His tone was resigned. Quayle said accusingly, "You didn't even provide me with the various artifacts you claimed would prove to me that I had been to Mars. All that song and dance you went into, it hasn't materialized into a damn thing. Not even a ticket stub, nor postcards, nor passport, nor proof of immunization shots, nor—" "Listen, Quayle," McLean said, "suppose I told you—" He broke off. "Let it go." He pushed a button on the intercom. "Shirley, will you disperse 570 more creds in the form of a cashier's check made out to Douglas Quayle? Thank you." He released the button, then glared at Quayle. Presently the check appeared. The receptionist placed it before McLean and once more vanished out of sight, leaving the two men alone, still facing each other across the surface of the massive walnut desk. "Let me give you a word of advice," McLean said as he signed the check and passed it over. "Don't discuss your recent trip to Mars with anyone." "What trip?" "Well, that's the thing," doggedly McLean said. "The trip you partially remember. Act as if you don't remember. Pretend it never took place. Don't ask me why, just take my advice. It'll be better for all of us." He had begun to perspire freely. "Now, Mr. Quayle, I have other business, other clients to see." He rose, showed Quayle to the door. Quayle said as he opened the door, "A firm that turns out such bad work shouldn't have any clients at all." He shut the door behind him. On the way home in the cab, Quayle pondered the wording of his letter of complaint to the Better Business Bureau, Terror Division. As soon as he could get to his typewriter, he'd get started. It was clearly his duty to warn other people away from Recall Incorporated. When he got back to his Connaught, he seated himself before his Hermes rocket portable, opened the drawers and rummaged for carbon paper, and noticed a small, familiar box. A box which he had carefully filled on Mars with Martian fauna and later smuggled through customs. Opening the box, he saw, to his disbelief, 6 dead mawworms and several varieties of the unicellular life on which the Martian worms fed. The protozoa were dried up, dusty, but he recognized them. It had taken him an entire day of picking among the vast dark alien boulders to find them, a wonderful illuminated journey of discovery. "But I didn't go to Mars," he realized. Yet, on the other hand, Kirsten appeared at the doorway to the room, an armload of pale brown groceries gripped. "Why are you home in the middle of the day?" Her voice, in an eternity of sameness, was accusing. "Did I go to Mars?" he asked her. "You would know." "No, of course you didn't go to Mars. You would know that, I would think." "Aren't you always bleating about going?" he said. "My God, I think I went." After a pause he added, "And simultaneously I think I didn't go. Make up your mind." "How can I?" He gestured. "I have both memory tracks grafted into my head. One is real and one isn't, but I can't tell which is which. Why can't I rely on you? They haven't tinkered with you." She could do this do this much for him at least, even if she never did anything else. Kirsten said in a controlled voice, "Doug, if you don't pull yourself together, we're through. I'm going to leave you." "I'm in trouble." His voice came out husky and coarse and shaking. "Probably I'm heading into a psychotic episode. I hope not, but maybe that's it. It would explain everything anyhow." Setting down the bag of groceries, Kirsten stalked to the closet. "I was not kidding," she said to him quietly. She brought out a coat, got it on, walked back to the door of the Connaught. "I'll phone you one of these days soon. This is goodbye, Doug. I hope you pull out of this eventually. I really pray you do. For your sake." "Wait," he said desperately. "Just tell me and make it absolute. I did go or I didn't. Tell me which one." "But they may have altered your memory track also," he realized. The door closed. His wife had left. "Finally!" A voice behind him said, "Well, that's that. Now put up your hands, Quayle. Also, please turn around or face this way." He turned instinctively, without raising his hands. The man who faced him wore the plum uniform of the Interplan Police Agency, and his gun appeared to be UN issue. For some odd reason, he seemed familiar to Quayle, familiar in a blurred, distorted fashion he could not quite pin down. So, jerkily, he raised his hands. "You remember," the policeman said, "your trip to Mars. We know all your actions today and all your thoughts, in particular your very important thoughts on the trip home from Recall. We have a teletransmitter wired into your skull. It kept us constantly informed." A telepathic transmitter, use of a living plasma that had been discovered in Luna. He shuddered with self-aversion. The thing lived inside him, within his own brain, feeding, listening, feeding. But the Interplan police used them. They had come out even in the homeopapes. So this was probably true, dismal as it was. Why me? Quayle asked huskily. What had he done or thought? What did this have to do with Recall Incorporated? Fundamentally, the Interplan cop said, this has nothing to do with Recall. It's between you and us. He tapped his right ear. I'm still picking up your mentational processes by way of your cephalic transmitter. In the man's ear, Quayle saw a small white plastic plug. So I have to warn you, anything you think may be held against you. He smiled. Not that it matters now. You've already thought and spoken yourself into oblivion. What's annoying is the fact that under Narcodrine at Recall Incorporated you told them, their technicians and the owner, Mr. McLean, about your trip, where you went, for whom, some of what you did. They're very frightened. They wish they had never laid eyes on you. He added reflectively, they're right. Quayle said, I never made any trip. It's a false memory chain improperly planted in me by McLean's technicians. But then he thought of the box and the desk drawer containing the Martian life forms and the trouble and hardship he had gone gathering them. The memory seemed real, and the box of life forms, that certainly was real, unless McLean planted it. Perhaps this was one of the proofs which McLean had talked to Ghibli about. The memory of my trip to Mars, he thought, doesn't convince me, but unfortunately it has convinced the Interplan Police Agency. They think I really went to Mars, and they think I at least partially realize it. We not only know you went to Mars, the cop agreed, in answer to his thoughts, but we know that you now remember enough to be difficult to us. There's no use expunging your conscious memory of all this, because if we do, you'll simply show up at Recall and start over. We can't do anything about McLean and his operation because we have no jurisdiction over anyone except our own people. Anyhow, McLean hasn't committed any crime, he eyed Quayle, nor, technically, have you. You didn't go to Recall Incorporated with the idea of regaining your memory. You went, as we realized, for the usual reason people go there, a love by plain, dull people for adventure. He added, unfortunately, you're not plain, not dull, and you've already had too much excitement. The last thing in the universe you needed was a course from Recall. Nothing could have been more lethal for you or for us. And, for that matter, for McLean. Quayle said, why is it difficult for you if I remember my trip, my alleged trip, and what I did there? Because, the Interplan harness bull said, what you did is not in accord with our great white, all-protecting father public image. You did for us what we never do. As you'll presently remember, thanks to the Narcodrine, that box of dead worms and algae has been sitting in your desk drawer for 6 months, ever since you got back. And in no time have you shown the slightest curiosity about it. We didn't even know you had it until you remembered it on your way home from Recall. Then we came here on the double to look for it. He added, unnecessarily, without any luck, there wasn't enough time. Second Interplan cop joined the first one. The two briefly conferred. Meanwhile, Quayle thought rapidly. He did remember more now. The cop had been right about the Narcodrine. They, Interplan, probably used it themselves. Probably? He knew darn well they did. He had seen them putting a prisoner on it. Where would that be? Somewhere on Terra? Or likely on Luna, he decided, viewing the image rising from his highly defective, but rapidly less so, memory. And he remembered something else. The reason for sending him to Mars. The job he had done. No wonder they had expunged his memory. Ugh, the first of the two Interplan cops said, breaking off his conversation with his companion. Obviously, he had picked up Quayle's thoughts. Well, this is a far worse problem now. As bad as it can get. He walked toward Quayle, again covering him with his gun. We've got to kill you, he said, right away. Nervously, his fellow officer said, why right away? Why can't we simply cart him off to Interplan New York and let them... He knows why it has to be right away, first cop said. He, too, looked nervous now, but Quayle realized that it was for an entirely different reason. His memory had been brought back almost entirely now, and he fully understood the officer's tension. On Mars, Quayle said hoarsely, I killed a man, after getting past 15 bodyguards, some armed with sneaky peek guns the way you are. He had been trained by Interplan over a 5-year period to be an assassin, a professional killer. He knew ways to take out armed adversaries, such as these two officers, and the one with the ear receiver knew it too, if he moved swiftly enough. The gun fired, but he had already moved to one side, and at the same time he chopped down the gun-carrying officer. In an instant he had possession of the gun and was covering the other, confused officer. Picked my thoughts up, Quayle said, panting for breath. He knew what I was going to do, but I did it anyway. Half sitting up, the injured officer grated, "We won't use that gun on you. He won't use that gun on you, Sam. I picked that up too. He knows he's finished, and he knows we know it too. Come on, Quail!" Laboriously, grunting with pain, he got shakily to his feet. He held out his hand. "The gun," he said to Quail. "You can't use it, and if you turn it over to me, I'll guarantee not to kill you. You'll be given a hearing, and someone higher up in Interplan will decide, not me. Maybe they can erase your memory once more. I don't know. But you know the thing I was going to kill you for. I couldn't keep you from remembering it. So my reason for wanting to kill you is in a sense past." Quail, clutching the gun, bolted from the Connaught, sprinted from the elevator. "If you follow me," he thought, "I'll kill you. So don't." He jabbed at the elevator button, and a moment later the door slid back. The police hadn't followed him. Obviously they had picked up his terse, tense thoughts and had decided not to take the chance. With him inside, the elevator descended. He had gotten away for a time, but what next? Where would he go? The elevator reached the ground floor, and a moment later Quail joined the mob of Peds hurrying along the runnels. His head ached and he felt sick, but at least he had evaded death. They had come very close to shooting him on the spot, back in his own Connaught. They probably will again, he decided, when they find me, and with this transmitter inside me, it won't take very long. Ironically, he had gotten exactly what he asked to recall for. Adventure, peril, interplan police at work, a secret and dangerous trip to Mars in which his life was at stake. Everything he wanted as a false memory. The advantages of it being a memory and nothing more could now be appreciated. On a park bench alone, he sat dully watching a flock of perts, a small bird imported from Mars's 2 moons, capable of soaring flight even against Earth's huge gravity. Maybe I can find my way back to Mars, he pondered. But then what? It would be worse on Mars. The political organization whose leader he had assassinated would spot him the moment he stepped from the ship. He would have Interplan and them after him there. Can he hear me thinking? He wondered. Easy avenue to paranoia, sitting here alone. He felt them tuning in on him, monitoring, recording, discussing. He shivered, rose to his feet, and walked aimlessly, his hands deep in his pockets. No matter where I go, he realized, you'll always be with me, as long as I have this device in my head. I'll make a deal with you, he thought to himself and to them. Can you imprint a false memory template on me again, as you did before, that I lived an average routine life, never went to Mars, never saw an interplan uniform up close, and never handled a gun? A voice inside his brain answered, As has been carefully explained to you, that would not be enough. Astonished, he halted. We formally communicated with you in the manner, the voice continued, when you were operating in the field on Mars. It's been months since we've done it. We assumed, in fact, that we'd never have to do so again. Where are you? Walking, Quail said, to my death. By your officer's gun, he added as an afterthought. How can you be so sure it won't be enough? He demanded. Don't the recall techniques work? As we said, if you're given a set of standard average memories, you'll get restless. You'd inevitably seek out recall or one of its competitors again. We can't go through this a second time. Suppose, Quail said, once my authentic memories have been cancelled, something more vital than standard memories are implanted, something which would act to satisfy my craving. That's been proved. That's why you initially hired me. But you ought to be able to come up with something else, something equal. I was the richest man on Terra, but I finally gave up all my money to educational foundations. Or I was a famous deep space explorer. Anything of that sort. Wouldn't one of those do? Silence. Try it, he said desperately. Get some of your top-notch military psychiatrists. Explore my mind. Find out what my most expansive daydream is. He tried to think. Women, he said. Thousands of them, like Don Juan had. An interplanetary playboy. A mistress in every city on Earth, Luna, and Mars. Only I gave that up. Out of exhaustion. Please, he begged. Try it. You'd voluntarily surrender then? The voice inside his head asked. If we agreed to arrange such a solution? If it's possible? After an interval of hesitation, he said, Yes, I'll take the risk, he said to himself, that you don't simply kill me. You make the first move, the voice said presently. Turn yourself over to us, and we'll investigate that line of possibility. If we can't do it, however, if your authentic memories begin to crop up again as they've done at this time, then there was silence, and then the voice finished. We'll have to destroy you, as you must understand it. Well, Quail, you still want to try? Yes, he said, because the alternative was death row, and for certain. At least this way he had a chance, slim as it was. You present yourself at our main barracks in New York, the voice of the interplan cop resumed. At 580 Avenue or 5th Avenue, floor 12. Once you've surrendered yourself, we'll have our psychiatrist begin on you. We'll have personality profile tests made. We'll attempt to determine your absolute ultimate fantasy wish. Then we'll bring you back to recall. Get them get them in on it, fulfilling that wish in vicarious surrogate retrospection. And good luck. We do owe you something. You acted as a capable instrument for us. The voice lacked malice, if anything. They, the organization, seemed to feel sympathy for him. Thanks, Quayle said, and began searching for a robo-cab. Mr. Quayle, the stern-faced elderly interplant psychiatrist said, you possess a most interesting wish-fulfillment dream fantasy. Probably nothing such as you consciously entertain or suppose. This is commonly the way. I hope it won't upset you too much to hear about it. The senior-ranking interplant officer presently said briskly, he better not be too much upset to hear about it, not if he expects not to get shot. Unlike the fantasy of wanting to be an interplant undercover agent, the psychiatrist continued, which, being relatively speaking a product of maturity, had a certain plausibility to it. This production in a grotesque dream of your childhood, it is no wonder you fail to recall it. Your fantasy is this. You are 9 years old, walking alone down a rustic lane. An unfamiliar variety of space vessel from another star system lands directly in front of you. No one on Earth but you, Mr. Quayle, sees it. The creatures within are very small and helpless. Some are on that order of field mice, although they are attempting to invade Earth. Tens of thousands of other ships will soon be on their way, when this advance party gives the go-ahead signal. And I suppose I stopped them, Quayle said, experiencing a mixture of amusement and disgust. Single-handedly I wiped them out, probably by stepping on them with my foot. No, the psychiatrist said patiently. You halt the invasion, but not by destroying them. Instead, you show them kindness and mercy, even though by telepathy, their mode of communication, you know why they have come. They have never seen such humane traits exhibited by any sentient organism, and they show their appreciation. And to show their appreciation, they make a covenant with you. Quayle said, "They won't invade Earth as long as I'm alive." Exactly, to the interplant officer, the psychiatrist said. You can see it does fit his personality, despite his feigned scorn. So by merely existing, Quayle said, feeling a growing pleasure, by simply being alive, I keep Earth safe from alien rule. I'm in effect, then, the most important person on Terra, without lifting a finger. Yes, indeed, sir, the psychiatrist said. And this is bedrock in your psyche. This is a lifelong childhood fantasy, which, without depth and drug therapy, you would never have recalled. But it has always existed in you. It went underneath, but never ceased. To McLean, who sat intently listening, the senior police officer said, Can you implant an extra-factual memory pattern that extreme in him? We get handed every possible type of wish fantasy there is, McLean said. Frankly, I've heard a lot worse than this. Certainly we can handle it. 24 hours from now, he won't just wish he'd saved her. He'll devoutly believe it really happened. The senior police officer said, You can start the job then. In preparation, we've already once again erased the memory in him of his trip to Mars. Quayle said, What trip to Mars? No one answered him, so reluctantly he shelved the question. And anyhow, a police vehicle had now put in its appearance. He, McLean, and the senior police officer crowded into it, and presently they were on their way to Chicago and Recall Incorporated. You had better make no errors this time, the police officer said to Heavyset, nothing to do with Mars or Interplan. Single-handedly stopping an invasion of Earth from another star system. He shook his head at that. Wow, what a kid dreams up. And by pious virtue, too, not by force. Sort of quaint. He dabbed at his forehead with a large linen pocket handkerchief. Nobody said anything. In fact, McLean said, it's touching. But arrogant, the police officer said starkly, inasmuch as when he dies the invasion will resume. No wonder he doesn't recall it. It's the most grandiose fantasy I ever ran across. He eyed Quayle with disapproval. And to think we put this man on our payroll. When they reached Recall, the receptionist, Shirley, met them breathlessly in the outer office. Welcome back, Mr. Quayle, she fluttered, her melon-shaped breasts, today painted an incandescent orange, bobbing with agitation. I'm sorry everything worked out so badly before. I'm sure it'll go better this time. Still repeatedly dabbing at his shiny forehead with his neatly folded Irish linen handkerchief, McLean said, It better. Moving with rapidity, he rounded up Lowe and Keeler, escorted them and Douglas Quayle to the work area, and then, with Shirley and the senior police officer, returned to his familiar office to wait. Do we have a packet made up for this, Mr. McLean? Shirley asked, bumping up against him in her agitation, then coloring modestly. I think we do, he tried to recall, then gave up and consulted the formal chart. A combination, he decided, of packets 81, 20, and 6. From the vault selection of the chamber behind his desk, he fished out the appropriate packets, carried them to his desk for inspection. From 81, he explained, a magic healing rod given him, the client in question, this time Mr. Quayle, by the race of beings from another system, a token of their gratitude. Does it work? The police officer asked curiously. It did once, McLean explained, but you see, he used it up years ago, healing left and right. Now it's only a memento, but he remembers it working spectacularly. He chuckled, then opened packet 20. Document from the UN Secretary General thanking him for saving Earth. This isn't precisely appropriate, because part of Quayle's fantasy is that no one knows the invasion except for himself, but for the sake of Ver's milditude, we'll throw it in. He inspected packet 6 then. What came from this? He couldn't recall, frowning. He dug into the plastic bag as Shirley and the Interplan police officer watched intently. Writing, Shirley said, in a funny language. This tells us who they were, McLean said, and where they came from, including a detailed star map logging their flight here and the system of origin. Of course it's in their script, so he can't read it, but he remembers them reading it to him in his own tongue. He placed the 3 artifacts in the center of the desk. These should be taken to Quayle's Connaught, he said to the police officer, so that when he gets home he'll find them, and it'll confirm his fantasy. Standard operating procedure. He chuckled apprehensively, wondering how matters were going with Lowe and Keeler. The intercom buzzed. Mr. McLean, sorry to bother you. It was Lowe's voice. He froze as he recognized it. Froze and became mute. But something's come up. Maybe it would be better if you came in here and supervised. Like before, Quayle reacted well to the narcodrine. He's unconscious, relaxed, and receptive, but McLean sprinted for the work area. On a hygienic bed, Douglas Quayle lay breathing slowly and regularly, eyes shut, dimly conscious of those around him. We started interrogating him, Lowe said, white-faced, to find out exactly when to place the fantasy memory of him single-handedly saving Earth, and, strangely enough, they told me not to tell, Douglas Quayle mumbled in a dull, drug-saturated voice. That was the agreement. I wasn't even supposed to remember it, but how could I forget an event like that? I guess it would be hard, McLean reflected, but you did, until now. They even gave me a scroll, Quayle mumbled, of gratitude. I have it hidden in my Connaught. I'll show it to you. To the interplan officer who followed after him, McLean said, Well, I offer the suggestion you better not kill him. If you do, they'll return. They also gave me a magic invisible destroying rod, Quayle mumbled, eyes totally shut now. That's how I killed that man on Mars you sent me to take out. It's in my drawer along with a box of Martian mawworms and dried up plant life. Wordlessly, the interplay officer turned and stalked from the work area. Might as well put those packets of proof artifacts away, McLean said to himself resignedly. He walked, step by step, back to his office, including the citation from the UN Secretary General. After all, the real one probably would not be long in coming. So after all that, he still has memories of himself killing a man on Mars. You know, like you do. That was... I've gone an hour and a half without a break, which is awesome, but I do need to take one, even though I'm not really going to have time for much else. When I come back, I think I'll talk about this a little more, and, let me know what you think. I'll be back in just a moment. Excuse me. Okay, and I'm back. So that's a little bit different from the movie Total Recall. I like Total Recall a lot, actually. I really like Paul Verhoeven generally. Um, the movie was different. The uh, the whole movie is like there's this kind of that question about whether or not it really happened or whether it's just like a memory that's played around with for the duration of the movie. Whereas with the short story, it's more like um, it seems a little less ambiguous because in the movie there's an explanation where like in if you go to recall, there's a chance that the procedure can go wrong and you'll just be lobotomized because there's no hope for you. Um, so it's like he's either a secret agent or his memory is getting out of hand and he's going to be and he's being lobotomized. And with this one, it's just like there's no like there's no risk to it to doing recall. The fact that he actually is a secret agent isn't necessarily for dispute. It's just an innate thing, an innate part of him. Um, but you know, Philip K. Dick, he's because he wrote "Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep." That book was what inspired Blade Runner, a different science fiction movie, and that Blade Runner is really the keystone for the cyberpunk aesthetic, and maybe not the genre as a whole, but certainly a big part of it. And so, in a lot of ways, you could consider Philip K. Dick to be one of the first cyberpunk authors out there, since he's responsible for these stories that question reality and have a very philosophical twinge to them, where technology, rather than being helpful, is more of a hindrance, or at least used in a capitalist way that just exploits people like cattle. You know, all the fun cyberpunk stuff. Um, but in the movie Total Recall, which I think is on Netflix, it's, it's a lot of fun to watch. Um, he actually does go to Mars, at least so it would seem. But the whole point of the story, especially the short story, is kind of like the weird ambiguity of memory, because human beings, our entire life is based around memory. You know, like we remember learning something, we remember being a part of something, and that defines our identities. All if we don't have any memory, we're basically brain dead. You know. But the thing is that memory is still, despite that, memory is a very fickle thing. That we forget things, we lose track of them. Memories, we even have a tendency to rewrite our own memories unwittingly, especially over time. Things like might change, at least details here and there, if not the entire thing. So there's an interesting bit about that, playing with memory and not being really sure. Um, but related to this idea of memory, it comes from I haven't read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but I have seen Blade Runner. I actually have I have the Blu-ray version that has the original theatrical version, the director's cut, and the final cut, which are all different variations of the same movie, basically. Um, it's not my favorite movie in the world, if I'm being honest, but I like it enough that I wanted to buy the Blu-ray version, and I love the aesthetic of cyberpunk and the music, and um, some of it is great. But part of Blade Runner is that um, these androids, replicants, I think it is, they they can be implanted with false memories. And so one character in particular has vivid memories of her childhood, but she's a replicant, which means that she's only a few years old, even though she looks like an adult woman. But she has vivid memories, and one Harrison's Ford character, because he's the main character in that, um, he he recites those memories to her. He's like, when you were a kid, you know, you and your cousin Stevie or whatever went into the basement and spanked each other or whatever it was. And like she's like, oh, you know, I didn't tell anyone that. And he's like, well, I know because your memories are fake. And so like it causes this, you know, sort of existential crisis. But it also, that movie as a whole, like it begs the question as to like how can you be sure that your memories are even real, because they're so distant from you in the long term that, you know, for all, like you might remember that stuff happening but you don't have a grasp of it, if that makes sense. um it kind of like it sounds a little silly when you say it out loud, like because it's not just that you remember it but you remember experiencing it, but then there's this like there's this blurring line between whether you actually experienced it or whether you just remember or whether you just remember experiencing it. Um, I don't know if anybody on this watching the stream would ever take advice from me, but if you would, I would definitely recommend that you keep a journal. Just especially when you have any particular strong thoughts or strange experiences, because that in part really gives you a sense of memory that's better than just your mind. And you know, going back to it, you'll see things that you thought you would never forget, and you totally spaced it. You would never have remembered if you hadn't written it down. Um, I'm not the most diligent in journal writing. I don't do it very often. Even when I have some, like most of the time, I don't have anything to say. Uh, but even when I do, you know, I don't necessarily write it down. And like I'll go back and I'll just be like, man, I totally forgot about that. You know, I forgot that that happened, and I thought I never would. So keep a journal, even if it's just something simple. Write down things that happen when they happen. Talk about yourself, who you are, and where you've been, because that journal will help make things real. As I talk about this out loud, like I understand that idea of memory being fickle, but I don't feel like that's actually like a crisis, you know, if that makes sense. Because some people might think back on that and they're like, oh, you know, that's true. You know, I don't remember any of this stuff, or I do remember that, but how do I know it really happened? And for me, like I look back on my life and I know it is technically just memory. It's it's just it's something that changes and that I forget and all this stuff, but I don't feel detached from it, if that makes sense. Like I don't feel like there's any risk of my memories being fake. And maybe that's just because I have no way of knowing how something like that could be faked. But certainly people do, their memories lapse, they change, they transform. And some people are better at keeping their memories than others. And of course, if you drink, if you do drugs, or you know, if you have some kind of mental illness, that can also affect your memory. But I remember reading about ancient religions, and there's this kind of common thread about how old religions would sometimes, in the afterlife, they would have this thing, this kind of moment of memory where you had to find this sort of it varied. In Greek religions it was like a fountain, a font of water, and if you drank from it, you would retain your memories from life. Um, and if you didn't drink from it, you would basically just lose your entire identity and wander as a vagrant soul for the rest of eternity. And then I say Greek. I guess that was more Orphic. I don't know if that was exclusively Greek. In fact, as I think about it, it was probably more of an Eastern thing, Near Eastern, Middle Eastern. And then in Chinese mythology or religion, I don't know. Um, there was talk of an old woman called, I think her name was like Old Lady Ging or something like that. And basically, when people would reincarnate, like they would die, and then before they would be born again, she would make them drink this tea that she made, which would cause them to forget everything, so that when they were born, they didn't retain memory. But of course, that in and of itself poses an existential question. If you were to accept that as truth, you were to say that, I'm the same spirit as before, but I don't have any memory. You think, well, are you really the same spirit? Like, what is it that makes you the same if you don't have your memories? And not Total Recall, this short story does kind of have that a little bit, because even though his memory's been erased or that he's under the drug, like it's absolutely innate that he remembers being an agent for this company. It cannot be erased. There's just no forgetting. And in fact, he bastardized that false memory in order to make it fit his narrative as an assassin on Mars. Which poses the question, like, did he fake the whole thing, or was it just that, um, like, is it just that maybe it was such a perfect fantasy that he ingested it, internalized it to such an extent that that the moment those false memories were implanted, that he just immediately accepted them and wouldn't let go. Of course, that's all just postulating. At that point, you're basically writing your own fan fiction, your fan theory, your head canon, whatever you want to call it. Head canon. That's another thing about memory. This idea, certainly a postmodern idea, that reality is based solely on our senses and our memories, or if you don't sense something, if you don't remember it, it's technically never really happened in a sense, which is, complete BS, because like something as simple as germs, you can't necessarily notice germs happening, but if you don't wash your hands, they're still there. Just because you don't perceive something, just because you forget about it, doesn't mean it's not happening. And of course, there's all these scientific hypothesi. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. This idea that there has to be inevitably some sort of unseen force in the universe that we currently have no way of measuring. You think about it sort of like radiation, right? Like, you may not feel irradiated if you were to step in radiation. And in fact, there are a lot of common household objects that emit irradiation, like bananas. Bananas emit it. And, if we didn't know what radiation was, if we didn't have a way to measure it, we would never know that. If we never developed the technology for it, we would never know that a banana could. I mean, I don't know if a banana could irradiate you. I don't know if you could get cancer from standing around bananas your whole life. I don't know. I don't want to find out because I don't like bananas that much. And I don't like cancer nearly as much either. Um, but it does pose questions about, uh, the reality of things we don't perceive. And then you get into human imagination, speculative fiction, and all that stuff. And that's another, certainly a cyberpunk trope. This idea about implanting memories or erasing them, because ideally you could control your life by doing that. Like, if you're just some lowly clerk, you could go to Mars by having a false memory implanted. And then potentially you could also forget that you went to Mars if you had that. So you have this complete dominance over your life. Um, but of course, part of part of the story is that despite all their control, they still don't have control over that. At least as far as we can tell, Quail is still like they can't really control his memories. They can't control who he is as a person, despite having a certain control over his memories. He's still who he is, and in the end, trying to control that just made it worse. Um, but of course, it's speculative fiction. It's it's artistic in a sense. It's not necessarily what would literally happen if we could control memories. Um, but it is a sort of philosophical point. Although it's a scary idea that if we could control a person's memory at all, if we could willingly erase parts of it or add things in, like, if we were capable of doing that, would we want to do that? Would we, like, who knows what can happen? Maybe Quail is innocent. Maybe he is. Maybe it's just a memory gone bad and he ends up getting killed for it. And it's no coincidence that these shady interplay, they don't just hire assassins, but they have like telepathy. They're listening in on selected people. That in and of itself is terrifying because most people, like, you can't. At least I can't. I don't have that much control over my thoughts. Try as I might. But if someone were to read my thoughts, I'd probably be arrested several times over. I'm not going to say why, but definitely arrested. And it just goes back to that. Like, your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't think whether they should. But the idea of anyone trying to control memory is terrifying. And even more terrifying, rather than failing and killing an innocent person, potentially, or at least not being able to kill a person like that, is being able to succeed and having that kind of control over the human psyche. Because it does beg the question, like, if you could completely control a person's memory, like pushing buttons on a machine, what does that say about human consciousness? What does that say about human life? Because from ancient times, we've conflated the memory with soul. You die, and even though you might forget before you're reincarnated, you still have those memories. You still remember what's happened. And when you forget your memory, such as with the old lady serving tea, you're reincarnated. That's when you become a new life, because that's what happens before you become a new person. You lose your memory. And that's happened before. There have been weird cases of people, or at least one person I know of, I think in the United States, who one day just entered a fugue state, completely forgot who he was, established a new identity, and then 2 years later suddenly remembered who he was. And it begs the question as to how, like, a person, like, what would they retain about themselves? Like, let's say this guy doesn't like chocolate, and then he enters his fugue state. Does he still like chocolate? Is that part of his identity? Is there any part of his original identity that remains despite the lapse in memory? Is that possible? If it is, then that implies that there's more to life than just memory, that the soul has this inherent quality to it. In fact, it might even be proof of a soul, depending on who you ask. Conversely, if he doesn't like chocolate, does that mean that he doesn't have a soul? Does that mean that he's a completely different person? Would he react the same way to certain situations as he had prior to that? What really defines a personality if not our memories? Would you still be the same person if you lost your memory, is what I'm trying to say. Even if you changed your name and you thought you went to Mars, or you forgot that you did, and you started a new life in Saskatchewan or wherever it is that you went, and would you be the same person? Would you have the same cravings? Think about that in terms of psychology. Like, if you were to have a chemical addiction to something like, say, heroin, when you erased your memory, would you still have that hankering for heroin, or would you just be like, oh man, I feel kind of weird? I mean, obviously, there's the bodily reaction to heroin withdrawal, but like psychology wise, would you still want heroin if your memory was erased? And if you did, and it's not simply a chemical reaction, does that mean that your addiction is part of your soul, your personality? If you still have that addiction and it's purely psychological, does that mean that the memory process did not completely do so? Or does that mean that there's more to you than just your memories? Does that mean that you have a soul, that you don't have a soul? These are big questions posed by the idea of a soul, posed by the idea of memory and controlling it. I remember hearing a story, uh, I guess it's more of a factoid, if you will, about this old man who develops Alzheimer's or something, memory loss, dementia. And like he was still living with his wife, and supposedly like the story was that like this is supposedly something that really happened, despite the fact that he had lost his memory. Every time he lost it, he fell in love with his wife again. Like he just liked her so much that like that never changed. Um, and that's certainly a sweet idea, but it still like it poses a question like would he always fall in love with his wife no matter what memories he lost? Um, or is there like a breaking point where he would stop loving her? Sad thought, kind of getting depressing. Um, but anyways, so identity, memory, uh, all that stuff. It's a lot of fun. Go watch Total Recall. Even if you don't care about this philosophy crap, go watch Total Recall because there is a woman in that movie and she has three bazongas and it is breathtaking. I tell you what. But let's stop talking about bazongas for tonight. As much as I would love to keep going on about them, let's instead say goodnight and go our separate ways. Thank you so much for listening. If you are listening, if you're not listening, then you can go screw yourself. Go watch Total Recall. Rest in peace, Philip K. Dick. Hopefully, we'll be back next week, and if not, um, I don't answer to you, so don't bother me about it. But thank you so much for listening. If you are, don't forget to like and subscribe, and tell me that I'm amazing and perfect and can do no wrong, because that is really what keeps me going in the morning. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good night. See you next week.